Hi. Hello, CISW members, and for anyone else who may be joining us from wherever you are, wherever you're at, thank you for taking another hour to spend with us. It feels like it's been a while since I've seen everyone, so it's nice to have all your virtual names coming back up after the summer and some of the craziness, but as you know, we try to keep social distancing. I'm excited to have social workers who are engaged and excited to take on some of these continuing education opportunities that we are offering. So as always, my name is Alexandra Zanis. I am the Social Policy and Communications Coordinator here at the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Any policy and or communications questions, anything to do with the work that we do in terms of advocacy or the work that we do in terms of communications, please be in touch with me anytime. We love to hear from you. Couple little notes if you are new to our webinar platform, as it can be a little bit tricky. You'll notice that we condensed a lot of the windows on your slide to make sure that you knew where to access things. But please take a moment and make sure that it is set up for your viewing needs. So you can exit out of anything, you can enlarge certain things, you can minimize other things. Take a few moments, look at the widgets on your bottom screen, and just make it so that the system is best set up for your viewing needs. For me, sometimes I like to have the slides a bit bigger and the presenters bigger, and then the Q&A box as well for when any questions come into my head during the presentation. The beautiful part about having two incredible presenters here today, aka Sarisha, and then I'm going to be behind the scenes, is that I can take any of your questions that you type during the presentation and condense them for a more formal Q&A section at the end. So what I'll do is take all your questions, so just type them when they come to your head. Don't worry about waiting till the end, and we'll condense them and have a bit of a formal question and answer period at the end. I would really encourage that we type our questions, because this is going to be a good one to have answered during the live event if you have them. Also, for anyone looking for your completion or your certificate, your Studio My Tracker, you should be able to find that once you view about 40 minutes of this presentation. If you have any troubles accessing that, don't worry, you can log on anytime through the same link that you were emailed today, and then your certificate of attendance will be available anytime for you on this platform. So if you have some troubles accessing it today, or if you have to log back on and finish the required viewing minutes, just pop on tomorrow or the next day and you'll be able to access your certificate of attendance that way. As always, you can let us know if you have any issues with that as well. So just know that I'm on the back end today. I will be happy to answer your questions as they come. I am so excited to be joined by Sarisha today. A little bit of a disclaimer, Sarisha and I worked together on some anti-poverty work about a year ago, and just being in her presence is a true blessing. So I hope you all feel engaged and excited as I am today to have this presentation. Sarisha is the Executive Director of Leading in Color, which is a grassroots advocacy-based organization aimed to help racialized youth engage in policies and advocacy and projects for the policies that aim to serve them. So we are so lucky to be joined by her and Leading in Color today. Before I pass it on to her, and I'm very excited to do that, I'd love to do a quick poll with all of you to figure out where everyone's logging in from. Since it's been a while since we've done a webinar, I'd love to see where you're from. Or where you're logging in from, sorry. So there should be a poll on your screen under the slide section. If you have the slide section open right now, I condensed our options today for the sake of time. Oh, wow, look at us. We're already answering. Are you from the North? Are you from the West Coast? Maybe you're from the Prairies, Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada. Take a moment there and let us know where you're tuning in from. I'll give us a couple moments with that, and then I'm going to pass it on over. Oh, exciting. Everything's coming in. Lots from the Prairies. Welcome. Okay, so it looks like most of you have answered it. I'm going to go on to the next slide here so you can see. And now, honestly, I'm going to pass it away to Sarisha. Sarisha, welcome and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everybody. And thank you to the Canadian Association of Social Workers for inviting me to share how the area of social work and social workers can impact racialized communities and racialized youth in particular. I hope that you'll find my presentation informative, but most importantly, that it will challenge you to think critically about the work that you're doing and the way that you interact with racialized youth and their families in your roles, and why it's critical for our well-being, as well as for you as social workers to understand how your actions impact our lives. So just before we jump into it, Alex has explained a little bit, but I want to take a moment to explain who I am and what it is that I do. So in 2019, I founded a community organization called Leading in Color after I myself felt the effects of activist spaces were more concerned with this old school tradition of white saviorism and optics rather than actually supporting those on the front lines. And as such, I decided that the only way racialized communities would really get justice and make changes is if we did so ourselves. And that as racialized youth, specifically those who were raised with the access to things like citizenship, education, and other rights and privileges that were not necessarily afforded to the elders in our communities, that we had an obligation for many of us that is driven by cultural values to be the ones to lead the fight in all of these things. And so our goal at Leading in Color has been to provide racialized youth with the tools, resources, training, and skills development needed so that they can do this work effectively and with the necessary support to build community and share knowledge peer to peer. So who am I? That's kind of a loaded question, honestly. But I come into this space, of course, with the values presented by Leading in Color. But in addition to that, I am a South African Canadian of Indian descent, coming from a lineage of Indian Ocean slaves and indentured laborers oppressed in KwaZulu-Natal, which is the Kingdom of the Zulu, and most recently, apartheid refugees seeking safety on Turtle Island. I have a background in policy, advocacy, activism, and campaigning for human rights, and I hold a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science and world religions from McGill University. I currently operate in the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, though I was born on the traditional territory of the Kanagahaka Mohawk and raised specifically on Huron land in the GTA. So this links to my presentation today because I stand in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island who are bonded to South Africans in an often dismissed part of history, being that the elements of the apartheid system that once oppressed my family was modeled after the residential school system and the pass system seen in what is currently Canada. This is of particular importance in the context we're speaking of today because of the disproportionate ways that social workers have impacted Indigenous communities, both currently and historically. I would like to start off a little bit by telling you about my own personal experience with social workers. Just to preface this, that this story is unfortunately not one of good intentions, of support, success, but rather one of immense fear, harassment, racism, discrimination of socioeconomic class, and one that represents the norm for racialized communities. So for many people, in 2008, it was quite a difficult year for a lot of us, and I'm sure folks can relate. There was a recession that destroyed families, businesses, communities, and a government that already left so many of us out of their care, that this additional burden was detrimental to most of us. This was the case for my family in particular, who, thanks to job loss, we found ourselves on the brink of poverty, facing eviction, but lucky to have found a new and safe roof over our heads, a two-parent household who sacrificed everything to prevent us from suffering, and a supportive church community that we could rely on temporarily. However, in the midst of all this trauma, we were faced with the additional trauma of quite suddenly and through tragic measures, losing the last remaining elder in our family. Under normal circumstances, grief is already a difficult burden to shoulder, as I'm sure many of you know, and all the more difficult in a global crisis, as we're seeing today. But further difficulties arise for those of us who cannot trace our ancestry because of colonial violence like slavery. For us, our elders are not only the remaining connection to our histories, but when an entire generation passes, we're left with no access to that knowledge. So I'm going to pause here just to state that the next part of my story that deals with social work quite specifically is not my own. And so I want to acknowledge that I'm coming from sharing this place with permission, and sharing this story, having obtained the permission of my mother, who has agreed to share experience of working with social workers for this. So on that day in 2008, the day that my grandmother had passed away, my mother had a mental health crisis. This was the first time this had ever happened to her. It was the first time it had ever happened to anybody in our family that we know of, and had never experienced anything like that in our lives. The stress, the grief, and the loss of her mother-in-law, who was her third mother figure, having lost her biological mother at the age of 8, and then her adoptive mother later on, created a situation for this mental health crisis to manifest. And this situation created extreme harm for her mentally, and harm that my father, neither I, who was only 10 years old at the time, nor my younger sisters, of course, knew how to handle. As such, we tried to seek the help of others nearby, for example, our neighbors, and we lived in a predominantly upper middle class white town, and our neighbors had said that the best thing to do would be to call 911. So reluctantly, we did so, not knowing of any other option at the time. And as such, as racialized children, my parents had always told us to be aware of the realities of the people who would be coming to our door. So police officers, paramedics, and a social worker in this case. And that the police were not there to help us, which is pretty standard for South Africans, as a practice that we know of. But also that social workers, in their experience, would find any excuse to take us away from them because they'd seen it happen to other families before. So the police, as usual, were violent, and my father was forced to stay silent out of fear that they would then take him away and leave us alone to be taken by the social worker. I won't recount the details for the sake of privacy, but the image of my mother having a mental health crisis clearly brought on by grief, and then being handcuffed and put into a squad car to take her to the hospital rather than an ambulance with paramedics is basically burned into my memory. And while we were worried about the well-being of our mother, my sisters and I, each of us at the time 8, 10, and 4 years old respectively, were taken away from our father to be questioned privately by the social worker. Then individually taken into questioning in our rooms to be questioned again by the social worker. This in and of itself is obviously quite a harrowing experience, to be locked away in a room with a stranger that you don't know and forced to answer questions. But before all of this could happen, I, being 10 years old, had told my sisters, make sure you tell them the truth. Otherwise, they'll say that we rehearsed our stories, and that mom and dad told us what to say, and they'll take us away from them. And this is something that I had been raised to understand. And so it wasn't necessarily something I came up with on the spot. It was a tactic that we used to protect our families, right? So they told the truth, as did I. But instead of receiving questions on how we could be supportive in this very scary and uncertain situation, the social worker asked us if our parents did drugs, if they smoked, if they could afford to feed us, if they fought with one another, etc., going as far as to question my 4-year-old sister, and asking her if her 8 and 6-year-old older sisters ever drank or smoked in the house. They threatened to separate us from our families and from one another if we didn't tell the truth, all while forcing my father to wait outside with the police outside of our home, not knowing what they were doing with his children. Then the social worker said her assessment concluded that our stories had in fact very clearly been rehearsed. And this, I think, is what kind of radicalized me at that age, was knowing quite well that that was not the case. And hearing it from the social worker made me realize that my parents were right, that the stories they had heard were right, that the stories we hear from other families, the things we see on TV, things we see on the news about how our communities are treated was in fact correct, because now I had experienced it. So when she said that, she also said that they would be keeping track of us from now on. Eventually, they did leave. And a few days later, my mother was released from the hospital, where we were required to follow up with a social worker assigned to our case, or our file. Instead of explaining to us as children what mental health was, describing in any capacity what had happened to our mother, or why after a few days in the hospital she was suddenly okay and there was nothing wrong, or really anything of substance, they decided to threaten us yet again, promising my mother that if she ever had another mental health crisis, they would take her children away from her. This continued on for years, harassment of my mother and of our family rather than support. And when you look at the impact that this has on racialized youth at a personal level rather than a systemic level, My own anecdote is that when my own father passed away years later, my very first thought was, I'm 18 now, and I'd been 18 for a couple months. So if the social worker comes back again, I can legally take guardianship of my sisters. And that was what was going through my head at that time because of the years of harassment we had experienced. On October 22nd, 2019, I was finally able to breathe again, in a sense. And that was the day that my youngest sister turned 18, because I realized then we wouldn't have to deal with this threat over our heads anymore. And so 11 years of that, all from one day of a mental health crisis that had to do with grief. And subsequently has shaped the way I've looked at social work, both in my experience and then drawing on the experiences of other racialized youth. So I share these parts of my story with you because my experience as a racialized youth with social workers were interactions aimed at inducing fear, demonstrating power, exercising control over my family, and diminishing our autonomy, with the ultimate goal of removing us from our parents' custody. But what should have happened instead? And what could have happened instead? They could have explained to 3 underage kids what was happening. They could have calmed our anxieties and helped us navigate that difficult night. They should have offered us guidance on grief and mental health and provided us with resources and skills to move forward as a family, with the ultimate goal of supporting us as children. But sadly, my story is one of the milder cases, comparative to other racialized communities, which we'll discuss in a little bit. But it's also not unique by any means. Social work in racialized communities looks like 3 things: the policing of bodies, the surveillance of families, and the criminalization of poverty. So as I mentioned earlier, social work disproportionately affects racialized communities, but in particular, it disproportionately affects Indigenous communities in what is currently Canada. And this is especially true because social work is a form of policing. As social workers, you are granted control and decision-making over the bodies of racialized communities, with particular control over our wombs in many cases. This falls in line with the genocidal practices of the Canadian state across its varying systems of policing, because you're given authority over our children, over making or breaking our family structures, and in turn impacting the mental and physical well-being of our community, and in my case, as a young person. You're empowered to make assessments and judgments outside of that of a medical professional on our mental and physical fitness and well-being. You're also systemically given authority over our culture and identity in the way that we raise our children, in the way we build our relationships, the way we operate our family structures, dictating different levels of assimilation that we must abide by in order to fit the rule of law. All of these forms of policing our lives impact the way that racialized youth are taught to interact with your system, you as social workers, and the authorities that you report to. They also impact how we are raised. So, for example, whitewashing our cultures, from the foods that we bring to school for lunch, to the clothing that we wear, and the ways that our parents care for us. It's important to note that when people are discussing abolition of police, they are including social work in that. They look at social work as a system of policing. And it's important to understand that and to recognize that, because it's its own system of policing in Canada, and it's been used historically to police peoples, again, especially Indigenous peoples. Social work can also look like surveillance. So social work for racialized youth and our communities also looks like having our movements tracked. As you heard in my personal story, our movements are continually tracked, like the saying, once you're in the system, you're there forever. Where are we going and when? What are we doing there and with whom? Our actions are monitored, and so to speak, people are ready to lunge when we step out of line in the eyes of the system that is meant to subdue us. This then allows you to make judgments and subsequent decisions over our lives, which in turn negatively affects our communities again. And so being raised in an environment where social workers are meant to surveil you obviously adjusts the way that we interact with social workers. It also changes the way that we interact with the broader systems at large, again, back to policing, because they all play a part of the same system. Social work in racialized communities is also looked at as the criminalization of poverty. So when we're talking about the criminalization of poverty, this can mean a few things. Again, as you heard in my story, this was undoubtedly a factor in my case in the way that we were treated. While my family was privileged enough and lucky enough to have a roof over our head, we were dealing with poverty and with varying access to the supports that we needed. But this wasn't something that the social workers knew at the time. This wasn't anything to do with what happened in our situation. It was just the underlying experience that we were living that no one knew about. And so when we're struggling and our families are surviving because our parents or our grandparents, our communities are putting in the hard work and sacrifice to continuously ensure that we're taken care of, yet they receive the threat of punishment. For us, for example, for no longer living in our big house in the new subdivision of our town, a mental health crisis turned into a deep dive of our financial situation. Having open access to everything from my parents' paychecks to where any of our funding was coming from, to the support that our churches were providing with us or us with. All of that access was given to social workers in the name of protecting us as children, which wasn't what was being done in reality. So this provided even further surveillance and the constant threat for my parents that at any point their children would be stolen from them. This provides no agency over one's own life. So we're quick to strip families, to strip families of one another in favor of providing funding, for example, to more often than not white families who will then support and are supposed to care for racialized youth, rather than supporting our own parents and caregivers in the same way. And again, this disproportionately affects Indigenous children. So when we look at my own story and the story of other racialized youth who have interacted with social workers, for me, my story then shifts. So I live this life of fear and harassment, and quite literally just a violation of our human rights on a regular basis by social workers. But today, my former therapist has a master's of social work. I was just talking to Alex about this, and the system looks a little bit different for me. But for others, and again, especially Indigenous communities, that's not the case. The system does not look different. The faces may be different. The methodology may be different in some cases, but the end result is still the same. And that's what we need to actively work against in order to create some sort of change. And abolition, as unfortunate it might be for some of you to hear, abolition is one of those ways. But in the meantime and in the midst of that, there are other things that you can do to push forward this conversation, to learn more about what it is you're doing and the impact that you're having on these communities, to challenge the ideas that you've been taught, to practice your profession in a way that doesn't aim to criminalize poverty, to surveil families, and to police our bodies. There are ways that we can look at that. So some of these questions to ask yourself is basically, what do we do now, right? So what I've laid out for you is actually a very tame level of critique of social work and the systems that it interacts with, because again, and I want to stress this, my story is very, very, very different than that of Indigenous children, of Black children, of racialized youth who are already discriminated against and oppressed in other ways. My story is one of privilege because I'm here today, my family was intact, and we are able to move forward together. But that can't be said for everybody. So there is much more to be seen in the discrepancies that exist between racialized communities, those who are further oppressed, like Black and Indigenous communities. The first piece is that the profession that you are in is overwhelmingly white. And as a result, white supremacy manifests in the actions of social workers like the ones that I had to deal with over the course of 11 years. Some people will openly tell you that your jobs cannot be reformed, like I said, because they are part of a broader system of oppression, and you are used as a tool to oppress racialized youth in our communities. That is something to listen to. That is something to take to heart. And it is something challenge yourself, to recognize and to better understand. And some folks that I would say to listen to in regards to that, who are far more eloquent at saying it than me. Pam Palmater is one who talks about social work and policing. Sandy Hudson from Black Lives Matter Toronto, another one to keep an eye out for on their podcast. Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. They've had some good conversations around this as well. So other people that you can check out, and other folks who are doing this work and who have been doing this work and can speak to it from the perspective of Black communities and Indigenous communities in particular. But so here are some of the questions that I want you to think about. And I hope that maybe you'll ask some of these questions back to yourselves in a little bit before we take questions. But the first being that are you doing the work to fight against the racist and colonial practices and values that exist in your work? And if you don't mind sharing, I would like, if it's possible, and maybe Alex can just tally this up a little bit, but if it's possible for you to share some of those in the chat, what are the things that you do to fight against racist and colonial practices and values in your work? That could be in your everyday work, maybe in your academic background, so forth. Do you actively resist participating in the colonial structures set by your profession? Do you challenge the way you work? Do you challenge the work that you do? How do you do this? Why have you placed yourself in this space to begin with? So what got you into social work in the first place? What was the trigger for you to say that this is what you wanted to do? Why have you dedicated your life to it? Similarly to that, why do you rely on it for your own sustenance, right? So looking at the work that we do and the salaries that we take in our own work, and what does that look like and what does that mean? And that's another conversation that links back again to social work and policing. What was your end goal when you started? And what is it now? Does your end goal match up with what is happening systemically in your work? Does it match up historically? And are you a part of the problem? If so, what are you doing to make the necessary changes? Those are a few things I'm hoping that we can maybe have a little bit of a longer discussion on. I know those are a lot of questions, but I would love to hear in particular some of the ways, again, that you're actively fighting against racist and colonial practices that exist in the profession. And in particular, if you have any tips to share with one another, but I would also like to hear it. Can we jump to that a little bit, Alex? Is that okay? Before I continue on.
Sorry, can you hear me now? I was muted.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh my goodness, I swear it's going to be the proverb of 2020. Sorry, I was muted. Absolutely, we can. So for everyone who is just logging on, please note that you have a chat function at the bottom of your widget. So take a few moments and let's actually answer these questions that Sarisha has up on the slide deck here. So you can use that Q&A section there. So one of the questions, Sarisha, sorry. Okay. It is like, it's one of those days, right? Like trying to get a lot of words in my mouth at once. So one of our attendees says, I'm currently a social work student and we have a strong focus on anti-oppression and decolonization. So we have changed our curriculum this year to further reflect this. And as someone myself who actually fairly recently went through the education system, you know, we too have added in a couple classes here and there that hope to spark the conversation of how social work contributes to oppressive practices. So, Sarisha, can you speak a little bit to maybe how changing curriculum can help with this, and maybe other ways that we can strengthen changing curriculum to better support these practices?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's great. Thanks for sharing that. I think that is a start, and it's probably the sort of like first point of action is to change the curriculum. And so focusing on anti-oppression and decolonization is great, but I guess it's what does that look like, right? So for some people will say decolonization looks like changing the profession. And for others, it looks like abolishing it. And what does anti-oppression look like within those contexts, right? So the work that you're studying, the work that you're doing, are you learning from people who have had experiences with social workers? Are you learning from racialized people, racialized scholars, racialized community workers who have gone through sort of the experiences themselves and additionally have the academic credentials or any other form of credential to back it up? Who is it that's changing the curriculum? So is it your professors? Are they cis het white men? Are they white women who are then bringing in additional outside sources? And what do they gain from doing that, right? So there's a whole bunch of questions to ask in that space. But I think it is a necessary step because the goal is, at the end of the day, to change the way we're working, right? And to change these things from happening so that people don't have the experience that I had and other people don't have experiences that are worse than what I've had. And so looking at academics is one way to do it, and in your schools, because that's when you produce generationally folks who are more committed to social justice, who are committed to anti-oppression, who are committed to decolonization. And that's something I think resonates with my story as well. Like I mentioned, I've used therapists who have been masters of social work and do social work as their profession. And that's not something when I was in high school or anything like that, still dealing with this trauma, that I would have been able to be comfortable with, right? And so that's a testament to the way things have changed in the education system. And I think pushing it even further is incredibly important for sure.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I mean, I think too, having the conversations as students, and if you are a racialized student, hopefully you aren't bearing the burden of always being the one to encourage your professors and your faculties of social work to start these practices. Hopefully, there are spaces within schools of social work in which there are allies who are also going to be able to enable the discussion around how do we decolonize and create safer spaces within academia for social work. So hopefully we're starting to see those shifts as well of increased voices calling for better action. One of the things I wanted to note that really kind of hit me when Sarita was presenting was one of the attendees was speaking about the need for us to get uncomfortable. And so at the CISW, we have heard this overwhelmingly, not even because of COVID or because of feelings of addressing systemic racism, but this idea that we need to get really uncomfortable for things to change. And so one of the attendees mentioned how important this presentation is in getting uncomfortable in order to start doing the work and feeling those feelings of uncomfortable emotions and then acknowledging them and sitting with them as well. So Sarita, can you speak a little bit to that knee-jerk response when things get uncomfortable, especially when we're talking about race? I mean, as a white woman, as a settler here in Canada, I also get a little bit uncomfortable when talking about race. Can you speak to why that might be important and different ways, to start moving forward in the path that we desperately need to move forward on as a profession?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to follow up quickly on the previous question, the one thing I did want to note is that challenge your professors and challenge the institutions that you're learning from, because if you as students, if you are still a student, but if you as students are the ones who are taking the lead on that, then you're creating that change at your level. And I think that's really important. When it comes to being uncomfortable, I think the one thing I've learned is that I didn't have this knowledge like way back when. Even being able to present to you my story today has taken a long time. I didn't at the time know that what I was experiencing was discrimination and racism. I didn't know that it was being influenced by white supremacy. Sure, I had whatever my parents told me about policing and had told me about systems and had told me about social workers, but I didn't have the capacity or the knowledge or the language or the education to really understand that until later on in life. And that's why now I'm able to do that. And it can be uncomfortable, but that is part of it. Being uncomfortable is a privilege.
Yeah.
as opposed to living this experience. So if you're sitting here and these questions make you uncomfortable, they force you to question things about yourself, about your profession, about your work, about your academics. That is incredibly important. Like, you have to do that work in order to ensure that people don't live these experiences. Um, and
Yeah.
sometimes the sad truth is that uh, people feel uncomfortable because things are true, right? And so we get uncomfortable when we're unable to identify or relate to the fact that something is true that we don't want to believe is true, or that that feels offensive to us. And so recognizing that that is a space of privilege, again, to be able to feel that way as opposed to live this reality, and ensuring that when you're on the side of being able to just feel uncomfortable as opposed to live the difficulties that racialized youth are living, that's something to hold space for and to think about why that takes priority over our lived experiences often.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. And I very much do agree. The idea of being able to be in a space where we get uncomfortable is indeed a place of privilege. So thank you for highlighting that for us. So a couple other questions in terms of social work students, and there are other questions as well, but I'm going to stick with the questions that we have on the slide for a bit because they're so good. So if you can respond to some of the questions on the slide in the chat box right now, that would be awesome, and we'll be able to dive into some of these questions as well, knowing that there are other questions, and we'll get to them in a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, sorry about that. I just wanted to make a little bit of space to hear from the audience, because I know this is a heavy subject and people can feel uncomfortable. If there are questions, like, this is what I mean when I say I didn't have this knowledge previously, right? I had to learn this, and I had to learn and understand what it was I was experiencing. So if you're not experiencing it, you have additional work to do in order to learn what's really happening. So if you're comfortable and are interested in sharing with me, for example, what your end goal was, like why you sought out this profession, why you decided to study social work, why you wanted to become a social worker, and how that matches up systemically versus historically. I think that would be really interesting to hear the differences between those answers, for sure.
Yeah, and I think too, since we've opened up a lot of our webinars for students who may not have been members of the CASW before the pandemic, we've welcomed you into our family because we understand that you need access to the same services and supports and toolkits that registered social workers do during your education and during your training. So knowing that we have more students on than normal, what was it that kind of got you to pursue this profession? And for those of you who are on this call right now who have been social workers for 20 plus years, why did you start, and how has that shifted in the time that you've either been in the field or et cetera, et cetera? So use that chat box and let us know what you think. One of the responses I have, Sarisha, and I would love to have you comment on this, is a social worker who started off in child protection about 20 years ago. And who has seen huge shifts in child protection in terms of the administration of it, especially when it comes to Indigenous communities, and the hopeful new legislation that has come in through Bill C-92, which hopes to give Indigenous communities their own ability to provide child welfare services within their communities. Can you speak a little bit to how this could impact the racialized communities that you work with in terms of child welfare? Or could you speak a little bit to this transition and this shifting and what it means for racialized communities?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'll say is I'm not an expert on the experiences, obviously, of Indigenous peoples with social workers. I do have some sort of knowledge, obviously, but I'm not an expert in that. And so I would say, first and foremost, I think community-centered approaches are critical. In order to actually have systems that work for the community, they have to be community-led. And as such, having frameworks that embody that are really, really important. And I think that is something that is transferable to racialized communities that are non-Indigenous as well, right? But the problem that we have is that, are we going to create very different silos for every single racialized community that exists when the problem is the larger system at play, right? So how do we change that system? What do we do to that system to get it to properly care for children in particular, obviously, that are racialized, as opposed to having to do these one-off sort of policy changes to say that we've appeased this issue in one area, right? And when it comes to Indigenous communities, there is a whole separate history there that requires an additional response. And so if we're speaking more towards racialized communities, like my community that I lived in, again, was like 4% racialized in the whole region. And so I was living in a system meant to care for white children and not meant to care for me. And that would have been shifted had there been an approach within that system to care for me. And so bringing people into those spaces, I think, is really critical and important. And that when we're doing kind of these very specific community-led pieces or community-centered pieces, that there's a reason for it. It's not just because people are racialized, but it's because there's like that history associated with it. So there's kind of a two-pronged approach there, I would say.
Yeah, so I think so. Just as someone who gets a little bit nerdy about social work, going back to the absolute roots of the profession, our mandate was always twofold. So a social worker's mandate from the very inception of the profession was to, one, provide immediate services, and then to advocate for systemic change. So regardless of, the kind of changes that have happened within the social work profession, so the change between clinical social work and general social work and structural social work, we always had the same premise of providing an immediate service while advocating for long-term systemic change. So when I hear you say that, I think of all of the ways in which we need systemic change to address these kind of pervasive social issues.
Exactly.
So one of the comments being, and please continue to share your stories. These are incredible. And I feel so privileged to be here with so many social workers, so passionate and dedicated to the profession, and also dedicated to hoping to see it improve. I guess is a chill way of saying that. But so one of the comments being the decriminalization of poverty. So the decriminalization and or surveillance and or policing of poverty. So how do you see Canada addressing poverty? And then how would that impact social workers who are trying to work within this kind of, a system that puts Band-Aids on solutions to poverty?
Yeah, I think there are some policy solutions that I think have been helpful. I think they are still Band-Aid solutions. So the CCB, for example, is something my family had benefited from, and I know others have benefited from too, but it's not this be-all and end-all approach to changing the way poverty works in Canada, or eliminating it or reducing it. And I know Alex and I have experience with that from our work together. But when we're looking at the criminalization of poverty, I think it boils down to, and when we're talking about racialized communities specifically, right, the understanding that the process by which this happens is that your children are taken away and then somebody else is given the resources that you need to be able to take care of them, right? And what would it look like if we were just given those resources? If folks who are living in poverty, who are experiencing poverty, are given the resources that they need to live appropriately, rather than taking their children away from them, allowing them to continue living in poverty, and then giving financial aid or other forms of aid to a different family, largely white families, to take care of these children. And that's where Indigenous communities come into play. That's where the word genocide comes into play, right? When it comes to Indigenous communities. And then for racialized communities overall, like stripping us of our homes, of our culture, of our connection to our families, to our heritage, and putting us in these spaces because we're poor. rather than addressing the systemic issues that are in place. So I could talk about like a whole list of policy issues and financial supports that the government could provide, from housing to some form of universal income to some form of additional healthcare services like pharmacare, things like that. Like food security. There's so many things that we can talk about systemically, but it's that process when it comes to social work. It's that process by which the logic doesn't make sense, right? Why would you not just give the families the support that they need to take care of their children, as opposed to taking them away for somebody else to do it, and giving those people the support needed?
Yeah. And I'd love to note too, we are talking a lot about in terms of social work in the child protection sphere. Yeah. So for all of those who are, logging on, who potentially work in social assistance and welfare and employment insurance, and for those of you who are logging on who work in community health centers, or as Sarisha had mentioned, as a counselor or as a therapist, I know that we tend to be talking about child welfare here, but when we talk about poverty reduction strategies, I mean, you guys are the experts in terms of what's happening oftentimes on the ground. And so what we're asking from you through this webinar is if you are an expert in housing or poverty reduction, et cetera, that you try and take the lens that we are providing you today of a bit of a racialized lens in terms of how racialized communities oftentimes engage with social workers. It doesn't need to be directly in terms of child welfare practice. But thank you for noting. I did see a little note here. It has been a little bit child welfare focused, so I am flagging that we're trying to bring in different perspectives here, regardless of the sector of social work you find yourself in. Okay, so we are getting towards the time that we'll go into a formal question and answer period. So I'm going to quickly shake the Q&A button on your screen to hopefully give you an opportunity to find it and use it and ask any questions you may have. So please take a moment there. Sarisha, did you have anything else you wanted to say before we go into the formal Q&A section?
Yeah, so just maybe to touch on actually the different sort of streams of social work and how this relates to that, right? So like you mentioned, this is very, very heavy on child welfare, and that's because we're talking about youth, right, and young people. But that young people also exist in your relationships in the other streams that you're doing, and these same questions ought to be asked, right? Like the system as a whole is where these questions need to be asked to. So whether you're working in child welfare or in health or in counseling or whatever stream of social work it is, these questions still apply. The policing still applies, the surveillance still applies, and the criminalization of poverty still applies, right? And so ensuring that you're taking frameworks to ask yourself these questions continuously in that work is still really important, because the system as a whole is what needs to be explored, and not just each particular siloed sort of niche area. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah. Sorry. I'm reading through the comments here, and I feel very honored to be hearing some of the stories. I just want to read one out. I've always believed that society has created structures and systems which further oppress individuals living in impoverished communities. I wanted to be a voice for others and empower families and children to reject these barriers. Mm-hmm. I really feel that, because I think it's really scary a lot of times for communities to feel as though they can reject these barriers that people are talking about. So, Sarisha, can you speak to how we can engage and empower families to reject the barriers, like such as your story and what you experience?
I think there's a challenge in that, because it's so systemic, right? And so when it's hard to kind of navigate situation by situation, when the issue is systemic. And so I think the best thing I could say is that in your individual interactions with racialized communities and with racialized youth in particular, who might have experienced some of the same experiences, or experienced discrimination in other streams of social work, is to be cognizant of that and allow us the space to regain that agency. So whether it's control, like allowing, even the word like allowing us to have control is like that's the whole system at play, right? The fact that you would need to allow us to do that. But maybe making space for that agency to exist, and for making space for the priority to be the lived experience of the racialized youth that you're working with. Because to reject those barriers is hard from an individual standpoint, and kind of plays into the despite there being systems, like we can still thrive, which is true in some cases, and I'll give myself as an example of that. But requires a lot of access and a lot of privilege, and those are things that I have had as well, that others might not have. And so there's a little bit of a challenge there. So I think the best thing is to just in your own work to continuously do this work, and to practice these sort of questions on a regular basis, will help you in your individual casework with people that you're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, incredible. I have one question here, and it's almost more for me. It's what are social work associations doing to address racism in said organizations? And I think that is such an excellent question, to which I wish I could give a concrete response to. I wish I could tell you what exactly every single provincial association is doing to address and combat systemic racism. But as many of you know, we have different provincial associations, and within those provincial associations, sometimes there are even other associations in which you're a part of, and they all have their own policies and they all have their own practices in which they are trying to address, hopefully, especially at this moment, systemic oppression and racism. So in terms of the CASW, our most recent partnership is we created a MOU with the Association of Black Social Workers. So now anything that the Canadian Association of Social Workers does will be more or less run through the lens of the Association of Black Social Workers. So that was a recent partnership that was solidified. So that is exciting. And then we also are working with an Indigenous Circle network and the Thunderbird Circle through the Canadian Association of Social Work Education. However, one thing I will say, and this is a little caveat if my boss is online today, is that we are always looking for you to let us know how we can better address systemic racism in the social work profession, which is also one of the reasons that we have hosted this event today. So please know that the social work doors are always open for ways that we either perpetuate systemic oppression or ways that we can start to remedy it. At the CASW, we are founded in the TRC principles, as well as the principles of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry and the Association of Black Social Workers, knowing that these are all first steps in our journey of reconciliation, and that we welcome continued partnership and consultation as we move forward in this journey together. Whew. That was my little plug. I don't really want to talk anymore now. So we're going to go into the formal Q&A section here. So I'm going to pass it over to Sarisha. And Sarisha, can you maybe comment a little, and anyone who wants to continue to type questions, please feel free to use the Q&A if you're just logging on. Sarisha, can you speak a little bit to where we have to go as a profession, and what you'd like to see, and what Leading in Color kind of would like to see from the social work profession moving forward?
Yeah, I think that we're at a stage right now, like both culturally context, or the cultural context right now, where everybody is starting to realize that they need to do the work on anti-racism, anti-oppression, and decolonization. And for social work, that looks a little bit different because of the nature of the systems that are at play here, right? And so I think what I would want to see is a broader commitment to that, in terms of not just partnerships, but is your association representative of those groups? Is your provincial counterparts, are they representative of the racialized communities that are being policed in this way? And if that's not the case, what's going to be done to change that, right? Are the people in power still the white folks who have been doing this for years, and haven't changed their methodology